Thank you for joining us and welcome to Business Incorporated. I'm Chimezie Obi Iwagu. We get the show started now with the markets and the South African market. The JSE index ignored the rise in inflation to trade in the green at intraday. South Africa's inflation quickened to 4% compared with 3.6% in November, but remains well below the midpoint of the central bank's target range in December. The Nigerian stock index, on the other hand, lost some steam, trading 0.18% lower at midday Nigerian time. The EGX 30 in Egypt was up 0.90%, and Kenyan market did not trade on Tuesday. And it was mixed sentiment in the Gulf region. In the UAE, while Abu Dhabi traded down 0.55%, Dubai financial market was up 0.14%. Qatar was marginally up, and Saudi Arabia was down 0.37%. And in Europe, markets advanced in the morning after China unveiled measures to rein in the spread of a new strain of coronavirus that has killed 9 people so far. Well, it's a bright day today, and the market in Germany is not left out. Conrad is full of smiles, waiting to tell us what's driving sentiment. Right, Conrad? Well, an all-time high for the German share index DAX this morning, the first such record in 2 years. What took the German market so long? Other indices have reached one all-time high after another in recent weeks and months.
Good afternoon, Chimmy. Well, you know, there are too many sectors in this index, the German DAX, the Deutsche Aktienindex, the German share index, that had to go through very tough years. Take the car sector, for example, with the diesel emissions scandal, which weighed so much on the share prices. Take Deutsche Bank, another company that saw a lot of its reputation and a lot of its stock price fall over the recent years. That was basically what has held the German index back compared to other indices. But now optimism is really returning to the trading floor here in Germany. There's a lot of hope of investors that manufacturing will come back this year here in Germany. And also from Donald Trump, despite all his, rhetoric, this is an election year. People expect Donald Trump to want to win this election, which makes it less likely that he introduces policies potentially damaging global growth. This is something that Germany is hopefully going to profit from as well. But make no mistake, Jimmy, look at this is the record high this morning, above 13,600 points for the very first time. And you see after that, the market finds it not so easy to keep that record and to, decidedly decide for the upside. Of course, there are a lot of question marks attached.
I see that, Conrad. Well, let's see what BP's incoming chief executive, Bernard Looney, is up to. It's reported that the man plans a huge overhaul of the oil company, including broader emissions reduction goals. What's going on there?
It would be a huge overhaul that Reuters is reporting is in the making at BP. The new CEO, Looney, is expected to call for carbon emission reduction goals to include the emissions from fuels and products sold to customers. Those are called Scope 3 emissions. And up until now, BP, when talking about its emissions standards, had not taken those into consideration. It had only concentrated on the emissions of its own operations. But that makes it very different to some of its competitors. Repsol, for example, Shell, also Total, at least in parts. They are taking much more in consideration those Scope 3 emissions, emissions that come out of products and fuels that those companies sell. But under the pressure, as Reuters reports, of investors, BP is now reconsidering this. Investors want more and more that the oil makers really take into consideration the real cost, not only of their operations, but also of the products they sell, and that if you want the money from investors, you have to put a price on this. And that's obviously why BP now too is planning to change its standards. It's becoming more responsible for the emissions coming out of this company.
All right, in another corporate news there, Tesla has hit the mark of $100 billion market capitalization. Now it's worth as much as Volkswagen. Is this justified?
Well, of course, if we compare the two automakers, Volkswagen is far larger. It has many, many more employees. It sells many, many more cars every month than Tesla. But obviously, for investors, there is a big difference between the two car makers. And that is, of course, that Volkswagen, the German automaker, is carrying a burden of the past that Tesla does not have to carry. And that is, of course, the diesel emissions scandal and the large amount of legal costs that the car maker is facing. At the moment, Volkswagen is trying to get a legal settlement with thousands of car owners here in Germany who bought cars where Volkswagen cheated about the emissions. Daimler has the same problem. Today, Daimler warned that the false indication of emissions is causing legal costs to go up at another 1.5 billion euros, and that makes the operating profit of Daimler go down about 1 billion for the year 2019. So if you compare those old automakers from an investor's point of view, they carry too much of a burden of the past, and Tesla, well, is only about the future, which is electric driving.
All right, thank you for your time, Conrad, there. Enjoy the rest of the day. And in the UK, the FTSE 100 index opened slightly up in London. In the first few minutes of trade, the index was up 13.76 points. The wider FTSE 250 index was down 11.41 points lower. Let's see what the numbers are saying at intra-trade. Here is Juliana to give us details. Good afternoon, Juliana. So where are we at intraday on UK equities and the currencies? And of course, what are some of the factors, driving the directions?
Good afternoon, Chimese. Well, as you said, it's been an up and down day for the equities here in London. We started off pretty well. It doesn't seem as if the coronavirus scare that's rocking the Asia markets has affected sentiment in the city. At intraday, the all share is down 1.02%, but the FTSE 100 is up 0.19%, and the FTSE 250 is up 0.21%. The house builders doing pretty well on the FTSE 100. On the FTSE 250, a cancer research company is one of the highest risers there. In currencies, British pound doing pretty well. It's up on the US dollar by 0.19%, up on the euro by 0.14%, and up on the Japanese yen also by 0.27%.
Now, a new report by Social Mobility Charity says the City of London has become the epicenter of the elites, cutting off young people from poor backgrounds. Is this social inequality a reality?
Absolutely, Chimese, and I don't think it's just a reality for London. This is a reality for major big cities across the world, including, of course, where you are in Lagos. But bringing it back to the charity, yes, they've released this quite staggering data just showing how elitist London has become. For example, if you're a young person wanting to live pretty close to the city, you're likely to pay about £2,000 a month for a one-bedroom flat, which is the equivalent of about 1 million naira. And that's if you're not in zone 1, which is kind of where we are now. But it's also talking about jobs. A lot of the big jobs, the nice flying jobs that a lot of young graduates want to get, they're not paid for internships. And this is where you see the inequality really take place, because, of course, if you're from a poorer background, you need that money. If you're not working, you cannot support your family, you cannot pay your rent. So it tends to be that these people from working class backgrounds are not going for these jobs, and thus the elitist system starts to form. So what this charity have done is they're trying to urge the government to put in some new legislation. So if you are doing an internship for more than 2 weeks, that you're paid at least a minimum wage. And they're also looking at companies to take people from, more diverse backgrounds, especially the universities. There's been a big push, a big campaign here in the UK for the likes of Oxford and the other elitist universities to start taking more people from more diverse backgrounds, so there are more opportunities.
Another report says UK toy industry sales was down 6% last Christmas. Does this have anything to do with issues around new safety codes for kids-only toys and apps?
It's quite interesting, Chimezie. I was reading up on this earlier. It could be just that, you know, parents are getting a little bit more savvy. You know, you buy your child a toy, it's completely ruined within a couple of weeks. But no, on a more serious note, there's a toy expedition taking place in the UK at the moment. So they've just announced these figures, and £3.2 billion was made last year for the toy industry. It's a lot of money, but it is down 6%. In the UK, what they're blaming is Brexit uncertainty, which, of course, has been blamed for everything. And also, as well, the fact that there was a general election bang in the middle of their busiest period. But it's not all doom and gloom. They said they have been seeing some optimism. UK is still the largest European country to buy toys, and they have seen an increase, a 1% increase in the amount of people going back to board games, which are typically played with the families, so the likes of Monopoly, Ludo, Scrabble. That's on the increase, and also collectibles. So if you're like a Star Wars fan, or they've also seen a lot of those big Marvel action films, the increase in toys on that are 20%. So good news and bad news, but yes, that's the overall headline is that 6% fall year on year.
Well, Juliana, thank you. There, we're talking about inequality there. It seems to cut across every continent, every country, particularly in Africa, at least from the latest report from Oxfam. Well, let's see how the governments of these countries try to deal with the issue of inequality eventually. Thank you, Juliana. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.
And of course, talking about inequality there, the world's richest 2,153 people controlled more money than the poorest 4.6 billion combined in 2019, while unpaid or underpaid work by women and girls adds 3 times more to the global economy each year than the technology industry. Well, this is according to the Nairobi headquartered charity firm Oxfam in a report released ahead of the annual World Economic Forum of Political and Business Leaders in Davos, Switzerland. The report says that women around the world work 12.5 billion hours combined each day without pay or recognition. Let's watch this.
In its Time to Care report, Oxfam estimates that unpaid care work by women added at least $10.8 trillion a year in value to the world economy, and that's 3 times more than the tech industry. To highlight the level of inequality in the global economy, the Chief Executive Officer of Oxfam India, Ambita Behar, compared the world's billionaires to the case of a woman called in India who spends 16 to 17 hours a day doing work like fetching water after trekking 3 kilometers, cooking, preparing her children for school, and working in a poorly paid job.
It's important for us to underscore that the hidden engine of the economy that we see is really the unpaid care work of women. And that needs to change. They need to get decent wages, a living wage. On the one hand, you see the billionaires who are all assembling at Davos with their personal planes, personal jets, super rich lifestyles. And on the other hand, this Buchu Devi is not one person. I, in India, encounter these women on a daily basis. And this is the story across the world. We need to change this and certainly end this billionaire boom.
He says to remedy this, governments should make sure above all that rich pay their taxes, which should then be used to pay for amenities such as clean water, healthcare, and better quality schools.
If you just look around the world, more than 30 countries are seeing protests. People are on the streets, and what are they saying? That they're not going to accept this inequality. They're not going to live with these conditions.
Oxfam's annual report on inequality was released just before the World Economic Forum began in Davos, Switzerland.
We'll take a break. When we come back, we'll look at what Africa wants from Davos. Just stay with us. And according to the Oxfam's most recent research, in many African countries, the inequality gap continues to grow. It says despite the recent spate of economic growth, Africa remains afflicted by entrenched poverty and high and rising inequality. The gap between rich and poor is greater than in any other region of the world apart from Latin America. Well, heads of government and business leaders in Africa are part of the ongoing annual World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. What should they be discussing? Let's talk to Trinity Nkube a data scientist and wealth coach in South Africa. Thank you, Mr. Mkube. Thank you for joining us. Now, this year's Davos meeting, of course, focuses more on redefining capitalism with the theme, stakeholders for a cohesive and sustainable world. How apt is this discussion at this time?
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. I think this is an appropriate discourse at this point because the whole notion of just GDP growth has not quite served, the majority of African citizens. So yes, I totally agree with the idea that we need social mobility, across the board. We need to get our people into middle income and higher income, brackets for us to create sustainable wealth. So yes, I like the discussion. It's still quite young, and there's a lot of debate, obviously. Those that have been benefiting from the traditional capitalistic, system tend to resist this discourse.
Now, inequality and, of course, climate change feature more in discussions at this forum. Oxfam notes the rising gap between the rich and the poor, particularly in Africa. And we have African governments attending the Davos meeting. What should be on their agenda in the light of these developments?
Great. So when I look at this issue, of course, of our African governments, some of our heads of state actually did not even make it to the World Economic Forum because they're busy putting on fires at home. To avoid certain things, I think we need to look at three very important factors. One being, policy. How can we use policy in a sustainable manner in order for us to reduce income inequality? And I also look at business practices. It's 2020. We cannot still have the conversation around people being paid, unfair wages or, having wage disparities between, male and female or having different pay gaps just because of race. We cannot have that at this point. So business practices. And finally, institutions. A lot of people we are lacking social, cohesion because a lot of people have lost trust in the institutions. They do not believe that the institutions are fit for purpose.
Now, do you think the African governments are really doing enough to bridge the inequality gap?
Look, without bashing them so much, I think they've done a great job when it comes to extreme poverty. But when it comes to income inequality, there's still a lot of work to be done. As I just alluded to, the idea of social mobility, having our people into high income brackets, having a fair playing field, just having a conducive environment in which each and every person, economic citizen, can have a fair chance, at opportunities, having equality of opportunities. I think that is one thing that we really need to work at. As an example, right now, you still have a situation where a black professional earns perhaps 4 times less a white counterpart without any explanation in terms of the skills gap. So that surely we should be doing away with such things. Governments shouldn't be presiding over institutional, rigidities like that, and just having bad outcomes across that board.
Oxfam is recommending taxing the rich to pay the poor, calling for a more responsible capitalism. What's your take on this? And are there African countries to emulate in this regard?
That is a great question. I've always been a big supporter of Oxfam. I think they've been fighting, income inequality and poverty for the longest time. I do believe, though, that, progressive tax is just one of the tools. However, a more sustainable approach, as I said earlier, would be to look at the entire policy framework around income inequality and also the institutions and business practices. We have started to see reforms. In the South African context, these reforms have been quite slow to take into effect, and we'd like to see these being implemented in a more rigorous and drastic manner.
The World Economic Forum yesterday launched the Davos Friends of Africa Growth Platform community to mobilize the global community for what they say collective action to meet 100 million by 2025 job creation goal. What do you make of this?
I like the ideas. I think it's very ambitious at this stage. I leave at this time when we coaching entrepreneurs and so forth. We look at the idea of ideas plus execution equals contribution. The ideas are fantastic. We'd like to see these things being implemented. And I like the fact that we have a diverse group of business people, entrepreneurs, startups, and policy makers coming together. What we would like to see is implementation. And I think we'll have a greater contribution, as we have our people going up in the social mobile, framework.
All right, let's hope so. Thank you for your time, Trinity.
Thank you for having me.
Right, and the World Bank has issued its first bond denominated in Rwandan franc. The bond will be listed on the London Stock Exchange, and the sole lead manager is Citibank. With this transaction, the World Bank is contributing to the development of the country's local capital market and providing an opportunity for international investors to purchase a World Bank bond while gaining exposure to the growing Rwandan economy through the currency. The bond is the 7th sub-Saharan African currency that the World Bank has issued in or linked to. The RWF-denominated bonds offer investors an annual coupon of 9.25% and are payable in USD. The bonds will settle on January 24, 2020 and mature on January 20, 2023. And Angola will kick off the process to list 30% of oil companies Sonangol in the next 2 years, though not before the state-owned firm has been overhauled. In a first step, many of Sonangol's non-core businesses will be earmarked for privatization, after which the rest of the core company will be overhauled. The country's Minister of Mineral Resources and Petroleum says the government had hired Deloitte to help with the process. And with that, we draw the curtain on today's edition of the program. Thank you for being part of it. I'm Chimezie Obi Iwago.